At least now everyone knows why we invited you. My future daughter-in-law whispered at my son's wedding reception while adjusting the diamond brooch she stole from my late husband's study. You paid for all of this. The ballroom suddenly felt colder after she said those words. Crystal chandeliers shimmered above hundreds of guests dressed in black tuxedos and silk gowns. Waiters carried silver trays filled with champagne flutes, and a string quartet played softly near the dance floor. But all I could hear was the sound of my own heartbeat. I stood there smiling politely because women my age learned long ago that humiliation is easier to survive when you refuse to let people watch you break. My name is Eleanor Whitaker. I'm 68 years old, and the night my son married Madison Clark was the same night I realized I had spent years funding my own replacement. I'm glad you're here. Stay with me until the end, and let me know where you're watching from because by the time this wedding was over, half the guests refused to even look at the bride. The evening had started beautifully enough. I arrived at the Grand Bellamy Hotel just before 5 o'clock wearing a pale blue dress I'd purchased 3 months earlier after Daniel told me Madison wanted the wedding colors to feel soft and timeless. I remember standing in front of my bedroom mirror that afternoon, carefully fastening the pearl earrings Arthur had bought me during our anniversary trip to Charleston almost 20 years ago. My late husband used to say pearls made me look elegant, not flashy, and even after losing him 4 years earlier, I still found myself dressing according to what would have made him smile. Before leaving the house, I picked up the cream-colored envelope holding my gift for the newlyweds. Inside was a handwritten letter and a certified document authorizing the release of $200,000 from a family trust Arthur and I had established decades earlier. That money was supposed to help Daniel and Madison purchase their first home together. At the time, I still believed generosity could keep a family close. Looking back now, that may have been the most foolish thing I'd ever believed. The Bellamy Ballroom looked like something from an old Hollywood film. White roses covered every table. Gold candlelight reflected against mirrored walls. Guests laughed beside a 12-foot ice sculpture shaped like intertwined wedding rings. Everywhere I looked, people seemed happy. Mothers embraced daughters. Old friends reunited near the bar. Couples danced before dinner had even been served. For a brief moment, I allowed myself to think maybe the tension between Madison and me had finally softened. Maybe marriage had matured her. Maybe Daniel would stop looking exhausted every time he answered my phone calls. I should have known better. The first sign came at the check-in table near the entrance. A young event coordinator smiled nervously while flipping through seating cards. Whitaker, Whitaker, she murmured before finally pulling one free. Her expression changed almost immediately. It was subtle, just a tiny flicker in her eyes. Embarrassment. She handed me the card quickly without speaking. I looked down expecting to see mother of the groom. Instead, written in elegant gold calligraphy, were the words, family expense. For a second, I genuinely thought it was some kind of mistake. I stared at the card while voices and music blurred around me. Then I heard soft laughter nearby. 2 bridesmaids stood near the champagne tower whispering behind their hands. One of them glanced directly at me before looking away too quickly. Heat crept into my face. I'm sorry, the young coordinator whispered quietly. I didn't make the cards. I forced a smile because causing a scene at my son's wedding would only humiliate Daniel further. It's fine, I said softly, though my throat already felt tight. I pinned the card to my dress and walked into the ballroom pretending not to notice the looks from nearby guests. That was when I saw my assigned seat. Table 19, hidden near the kitchen doors beside the service station where waiters stacked dirty plates. Every other immediate family member sat near the dance floor. Madison's parents occupied the center table directly beside the bride and groom. Even distant cousins received better seating than I did. I stood there quietly holding my purse while guests brushed past me toward their elegant tables. No one from Daniel's side approached me. No one asked why I was standing alone. Then I heard Madison's voice behind me. Oh good, you found your seat. I turned slowly. Madison looked breathtaking in photographs, but in person there was always something cold behind her beauty. She wore a fitted white satin gown covered in hand-sewn crystals, and her blonde hair fell perfectly over her shoulders in soft curls. But my eyes immediately locked onto the diamond brooch attached near her collarbone. My breath caught. It belonged to Arthur. 3 years earlier, after a family Christmas dinner, that brooch had disappeared from my bedroom. I searched for weeks. Daniel insisted I must have misplaced it during the stress of moving some belongings after Arthur's death. Madison even helped me look, and now she stood there wearing it at my son's wedding. Beautiful party, isn't it? She asked sweetly. I couldn't stop staring at the brooch. Where did you get that? I asked quietly. Her smile widened just slightly. Daniel gave it to me, she replied. Apparently, it was sitting forgotten in one of your drawers. Forgotten? The word stung worse than it should have. Arthur gave me that brooch on our 25th anniversary. He had hidden it inside a velvet box beneath my breakfast plate while our children laughed around the dining room table. I remembered the exact way he smiled when I opened it. I remembered him fastening it carefully onto my dress before taking me dancing that night. Nothing about it had ever been forgotten. Madison leaned closer then, lowering her voice enough that only I could hear. At least now everyone knows why we invited you, she whispered. You paid for all of this. I felt something inside me shift. Not break, not shatter, just change, like a door quietly locking. Across the ballroom, Daniel laughed beside his groomsmen, completely unaware of what his bride had just said to me. Or maybe he was aware. Lately, I wasn't sure which possibility hurt more. Madison touched my arm lightly, pretending affection for the nearby guests watching us. Try to enjoy yourself tonight, Eleanor, she said brightly. This wedding has been stressful for all of us. Then she walked away toward the head table while guests admired her dress and photographers followed behind her like she was royalty. I remained standing beside table 19 staring at the kitchen doors swinging open and closed while waiters carried trays of lobster tails and filet mignon into the ballroom. The smell of garlic butter filled the air. Someone nearby laughed loudly. Glasses clinked. Music swelled. And suddenly I understood something I should have realized years earlier. Madison had never wanted me gone because I was difficult. She wanted me gone because as long as I remained part of Daniel's life, she could never fully control what belonged to him, or what belonged to me. Eleanor, a familiar voice said softly behind me. I turned and nearly lost my composure entirely. Rebecca Hayes stood there holding a small black leather folder against her chest. At 71, Rebecca still carried herself with the calm confidence of someone who had spent decades inside courtrooms, making powerful men nervous. She had been Arthur's attorney for almost 30 years and one of my closest friends for nearly as long. I wasn't sure you'd come, I admitted quietly. Rebecca glanced toward Madison across the ballroom before returning her eyes to me. Arthur asked me to, she said. Something in her tone made my stomach tighten. What do you mean? Rebecca exhaled slowly. Not here, she replied. But before this night is over, there's something you deserve to know about your son, his bride, and exactly where the money for this wedding came from. Rebecca guided me away from the ballroom through a quiet hallway lined with framed black and white photographs of old charity galas and political dinners held at the Bellamy Hotel decades earlier. The music from the reception faded behind us with every step until all I could hear was the soft clicking of Rebecca's heels against the marble floor. My hands still trembled slightly, though I kept them folded tightly around my purse so she would not notice. Or perhaps she already had. Rebecca had always been the kind of woman who noticed everything. She stopped beside a small private lounge near the back of the hotel and gently closed the door behind us. The room smelled faintly of leather and old books. A fireplace flickered quietly beneath a gold-framed painting of a countryside estate somewhere in Vermont. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Rebecca simply studied me with the same patient expression she used whenever Arthur and I argued over business decisions during dinners at our home years ago. You knew something was wrong before tonight, she finally said softly. I lowered myself carefully onto the velvet sofa beside the window. I knew Madison disliked me, I replied. That is not the same thing. Rebecca sat across from me and placed the black leather folder on the coffee table between us. Arthur was worried long before he passed away. Hearing my husband's name spoken aloud still caused a dull ache inside my chest even after 4 years. Some losses never become lighter. You simply learn how to carry them without collapsing in public. I glanced toward the ballroom doors as distant laughter echoed faintly down the hallway. Daniel used to adore family gatherings, I said quietly. When he was little, he would wake up before dawn every Thanksgiving just to help Arthur carve the turkey. He once cried for an hour because he thought we forgot to buy cranberry sauce. Rebecca smiled sadly. Arthur used to tell that story every Christmas. I nodded slowly. Now my own son barely looks at me unless Madison is watching. The silence stretched between us for several seconds. Then Rebecca opened the folder. Inside were copies of financial statements, trust documents, property deeds, and several pages covered in Arthur's familiar handwriting. My stomach tightened immediately. "What is all this?" I asked. Rebecca slid one document carefully toward me. 2 years before Arthur died, he amended the Whitaker family trust. I stared down at the paperwork without fully processing the words. "Why?" Rebecca folded her hands together calmly. "Because he started noticing unusual withdrawals from joint family accounts shortly after Daniel became engaged." A strange coldness crept through my chest. Daniel would never steal from us. Rebecca's expression softened. Arthur did not believe Daniel initiated any of it. I looked down again at the pages. Numbers blurred together beneath the warm glow of the lamp beside the sofa. "Madison," I whispered. Rebecca did not answer directly, which told me enough. I leaned back slowly against the couch cushions as memories began rearranging themselves inside my mind, like puzzle pieces finally finding their correct places. The expensive vacations Daniel suddenly could afford despite his struggling architecture business. The luxury SUV Madison purchased 6 months after the engagement. The designer handbags she casually rotated every season while telling me she was careful with money. At the time, I ignored my discomfort because I wanted Daniel to appear successful and happy. Mothers become very skilled at lying to themselves when it protects their children. Arthur hired a private forensic accountant. Rebecca continued quietly. At first, he thought there had simply been confusion with business reimbursements. But eventually, he discovered multiple transfers linked to accounts Madison had access to through Daniel. I looked up sharply. Did Daniel know? Rebecca hesitated. That hesitation hurt more than any answer she could have given. "We could never prove how much he understood," she admitted carefully. But Arthur became concerned enough to restructure everything before his health declined. I stared at the fireplace while old conversations replayed in my mind with terrifying clarity. Madison insisting Daniel should handle family investments now because older people deserve less stress. Madison encouraging me to sell Arthur's antique watch collection because sentimental clutter prevents healing. Madison constantly asking questions about trust funds, insurance policies, and property taxes while pretending she only wanted to help. I suddenly remembered the afternoon the diamond brooch disappeared. Madison had volunteered to organize my bedroom while I attended a doctor appointment. When I returned home, she seemed unusually eager to leave. At the time, I blamed my suspicion on grief. Now I understood grief had not made me paranoid enough. Rebecca pulled another paper from the folder. Arthur also added a protection clause. I frowned. Protection from what? Public manipulation, coercion, or elder financial exploitation. The phrase sounded clinical and ugly in the quiet room. My throat tightened painfully. Arthur believed Madison intended to isolate you from Daniel completely once they married. I closed my eyes briefly. The frightening part was not hearing it aloud. The frightening part was realizing Arthur had been right. Why did nobody tell me any of this? I asked softly. Rebecca's face filled with genuine sadness. Because Arthur loved your son. Tears burned suddenly behind my eyes, though I refused to let them fall. So did I? Rebecca nodded slowly. That is why he hoped Daniel would eventually recognize what was happening on his own. I laughed quietly then, though there was no humor in the sound. Instead, my son seated me beside the kitchen at his wedding. I am not entirely certain Daniel arranged the seating chart, Rebecca replied carefully. But he allowed it to happen. Those words settled heavily inside me because they were true. Daniel may not have created the cruelty, but he had stood beside it comfortably enough. And sometimes silence wounds more deeply than insults ever could. I looked down again at Arthur's handwriting near the bottom of one page. Even after all these years, seeing his signature still made me pause. Strong, precise, steady. Arthur always signed documents as though he expected them to outlive him. Perhaps he knew they would. There is more, Rebecca said gently. I inhaled slowly before nodding. She slid another document toward me. This one listed the trust conditions in detail. If Daniel or his spouse attempted to pressure, publicly humiliate, financially manipulate, or unlawfully obtain assets from Eleanor Whitaker, the trust would immediately suspend all future distributions to both parties indefinitely. I read the paragraph twice before fully understanding it. Then I looked up at Rebecca in disbelief. Tonight, she nodded once. The wedding expenses, Daniel's business expansion loan, the condominium downtown, even the honeymoon suite in Tuscany next month are all being financed through trust disbursements approved under your authorization. My pulse quickened. Madison does not know that. No, Rebecca replied calmly. She believes Daniel inherited direct control after Arthur's death. A strange stillness settled over me then. Not triumph, not revenge, just clarity. For years, Madison treated me like an obstacle standing between her and a lifestyle she felt entitled to possess. She believed age made me weak. She believed grief made me easy to manipulate. Worst of all, she believed kindness meant blindness. Rebecca reached across the coffee table and rested her hand lightly over mine. Arthur instructed me very specifically, she said. If there ever came a day when you were publicly humiliated by your own family, I was to place the decision entirely in your hands. I swallowed hard. What decision? Rebecca looked directly into my eyes. Whether you wish to continue funding your son's future. Outside the lounge doors, applause suddenly erupted from the ballroom. The reception speeches had started. Somewhere beyond those walls, Madison was probably smiling beneath crystal chandeliers while introducing herself as the newest Mrs. Whitaker. But for the first time all evening, I no longer felt humiliated. I felt awake. I slowly picked up the document containing Arthur's final amendments and carefully folded it back into the leather folder. Then I looked toward Rebecca and asked the question that had already begun changing everything inside me. If I stop the trust tonight, I said quietly, how long will it take for Madison to realize the wedding she mocked me for paying is the same wedding she can no longer afford? Rebecca did not answer my question immediately. Instead, she looked toward the ballroom doors as another wave of applause echoed faintly through the hallway. Somewhere beyond those walls, my son was probably smiling for photographs while Madison accepted compliments about centerpieces I had unknowingly financed. The realization should have made me furious. Instead, I felt strangely calm, like someone waking from a very long dream. The trust distributions can be frozen within minutes, Rebecca finally said quietly. But once that happens, Daniel will find out very quickly how much of his life depends on your signature. I stared down at the folder resting in my lap. Arthur's handwriting covered the margins of several pages. Small notes, reminders, legal concerns. He had prepared all of this while dying, and somehow he still managed to protect me better than I had protected myself. My throat tightened painfully at the thought. Arthur knew this would happen, I whispered. Rebecca's expression softened. He hoped he was wrong. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The fire crackled softly nearby, while distant violin music drifted beneath the ballroom doors. Then Rebecca leaned forward slightly. Eleanor, there is something else you need to understand before you decide what to do tonight. I looked up slowly. What else could there possibly be? Rebecca opened the folder again and removed several printed bank statements clipped together neatly. 3 months ago, Madison attempted to access the Lake Property Trust. I blinked in confusion. The Vermont house. Rebecca nodded once. My stomach dropped immediately. Arthur's family lake house had belonged to the Whitakers for almost 80 years. Daniel learned how to fish there with his grandfather. Every summer, Arthur and I hosted family cookouts on the dock, while children chased fireflies along the shoreline. After Arthur died, I could barely bring myself to visit because every room still smelled faintly like cedarwood and old books. How could Madison access it? I asked quietly. Rebecca hesitated before answering. She submitted documents claiming you intended to transfer partial ownership to Daniel as a wedding gift. The room suddenly felt colder. That is impossible. I never signed anything. No, Rebecca replied carefully. You did not. The meaning settled over me slowly, like ice sinking beneath water. Forgery. Rebecca lowered her eyes briefly. The signatures did not pass legal verification. I stared at her in disbelief. And Daniel? Again, that terrible hesitation. He claimed he knew nothing about it. Claimed. Not insisted. Not denied. Claimed. I leaned back against the sofa cushions while a dull ache spread through my chest. For years I had blamed Madison entirely because it was easier than admitting my son might have allowed this behavior to continue. Mothers spend decades convincing themselves their children are better than their worst decisions. But denial becomes exhausting eventually. Do you remember Easter brunch last year? Rebecca asked suddenly. I frowned slightly. Of course. That was the same weekend Madison first asked Arthur's financial manager about trust distribution schedules. Memories surfaced immediately. Madison sitting beside Daniel in a pale yellow dress while complimenting the antique silverware. Madison laughing too loudly whenever Arthur mentioned family property. Madison casually asking whether maintaining multiple homes became difficult at your age. At the time, her questions seemed tactless. Now they felt predatory. She was planning this long before the engagement, I said quietly. Rebecca nodded slowly. Arthur believed so. I closed my eyes briefly. Across the ballroom walls, wedding guests probably still saw Madison as graceful and charming. They saw polished smiles, perfect hair, and expensive satin. They did not see the careful calculations beneath it all. They did not see the years of quiet manipulation, the isolation, the subtle humiliations disguised as misunderstandings. I suddenly remembered Christmas 2 years earlier when Madison told me dinner had been moved to 6 o'clock instead of 4. I arrived carrying homemade pecan pies only to discover everyone finishing dessert. Daniel looked genuinely confused when I mentioned the time change. Madison laughed and blamed wedding planning stress even though they were not even engaged yet. Then there was Mother's Day when she accidentally forgot to reserve me a seat at the restaurant. Or the charity gala where she introduced me to one of Daniel's clients as Arthur's widow who still struggles with loneliness. Every insult had arrived wrapped in politeness. That was what made it so effective. Cruel people rarely shout at first. They smile while teaching everyone else to dismiss your pain. Why did Daniel stop calling me after Arthur died? I asked suddenly, more to myself than Rebecca. We used to speak every Sunday morning. Rebecca sighed softly. Grief changes people. No, I replied quietly. Influence changes people. The truth sat heavily between us because we both knew it was true. Losing Arthur had shattered me, but losing my son slowly over 4 years had hollowed me out in an entirely different way. One grief arrived all at once. The other happened gradually enough that I kept pretending it was temporary. Rebecca carefully closed the folder. You still have choices tonight. I laughed softly without humor. Do I? Yes. She held my gaze steadily. You can continue pretending none of this matters because Daniel is your son. Or you can finally allow people to face consequences for how they have treated you. I looked toward the ballroom doors again. Through the frosted glass, I could see silhouettes moving beneath chandeliers. Servers carrying trays. Guests dancing. A bride enjoying the celebration she believed she controlled completely. What happens if I freeze the trust? I asked. Rebecca answered calmly, almost clinically. The pending honeymoon payments are canceled immediately. The condominium mortgage backing is withdrawn. Daniel's business line of credit becomes unsecured within 30 days. And the final wedding vendor disbursement scheduled for Monday morning will not clear. I stared at her in shock. Monday. Rebecca nodded once. The Bellamy Hotel requires full payment after events conclude. Madison assumed the trust would release the remaining balance automatically. A slow realization settled over me. Madison had mocked me publicly while depending entirely on money she believed she could eventually take from me anyway. The arrogance of it almost would have been impressive if it had not been so cruel. I stood slowly and walked toward the lounge window overlooking the city streets below. Rain had begun falling lightly outside, blurring traffic lights into soft red and gold streaks across the pavement. For several seconds, I simply watched strangers hurry beneath umbrellas while memories crowded my mind. Daniel at age 6 building blanket forts beside the fireplace. Daniel crying after his first heartbreak in high school. Daniel holding my hand at Arthur's funeral while promising quietly, "You will never be alone, Mom." Somewhere along the way, that boy had disappeared behind silence and convenience, and a woman who treated compassion like weakness. I do not want revenge, I said softly without turning around. Rebecca's voice remained gentle behind me. No. You want dignity. Tears finally filled my eyes then because she was right. I was tired of shrinking myself to keep peace inside a family that no longer protected me. Tired of pretending insults were misunderstandings. Tired of watching kindness mistaken for helplessness. I reached carefully into my purse and pulled out the cream-colored envelope containing Daniel's wedding gift. $200,000. Arthur and I had saved that money over decades. Vacations postponed. Luxuries skipped. Extra hours worked. We built that future because we believed family meant permanence. My fingers tightened around the envelope slowly. Then I turned back toward Rebecca. If I freeze the trust tonight, I asked quietly, will Madison find out before or after she thanks everyone for the wedding I paid for? Rebecca's expression changed slightly then. Not surprise. Respect. Given the timing, she replied calmly. Probably during the speeches. For several long seconds, I simply stood beside the lounge window holding the envelope that was supposed to become my son's future. Rain slid slowly down the glass while traffic moved below the hotel in blurred streaks of white and red light. Somewhere behind me, Rebecca remained silent, giving me space to think. She understood something most people never did. The hardest decisions are rarely loud. They happen quietly inside people who have finally become too tired to keep accepting pain politely. I looked down at the envelope again. Daniel's name was written carefully across the front in my own handwriting. I had rewritten it 3 times earlier that afternoon because I wanted it to look perfect. That realization nearly broke my heart more than the humiliation itself. Even after years of distance, I still arrived loving my son. Completely. When did Arthur know for certain? I asked softly without turning around. Rebecca answered immediately this time. About a year before he passed. I closed my eyes briefly. Arthur had carried all of this while battling heart failure. While pretending family dinners still felt normal. While watching our son drift further away under Madison's influence. Suddenly, I remembered dozens of small moments that felt different now. Arthur becoming unusually protective over financial paperwork. Arthur insisting trust documents remain locked inside his office safe. Arthur quietly asking me once whether Madison had ever pressured me to discuss inheritance plans while he was not around. At the time, I laughed off his concern because I thought grief and illness had made him suspicious. Now I understood he had been trying to warn me without destroying what remained of our family. Why did he not tell me everything directly? I whispered. Rebecca stood slowly and walked closer until she was beside me near the window. Because he knew you would forgive Daniel immediately. Tears blurred my vision then because she was right. Arthur knew me too well. He knew I would excuse almost anything if it meant protecting my son from consequences. Mothers call it love. Sometimes it is simply fear. Fear that if you stop forgiving your children, you might lose them entirely. Rebecca folded her hands calmly in front of her. Arthur believed Daniel still had a chance to separate himself from Madison's behavior. I let out a quiet breath. And if he never did? Rebecca's expression turned solemn. Then Arthur wanted you protected financially before it became impossible. The room fell silent again. I thought about the first time Daniel introduced Madison to us nearly 6 years earlier. She arrived at our house carrying an expensive bottle of wine and complimented every detail of the dining room within 5 minutes. Arthur liked her immediately because she appeared ambitious and polished. I remember watching her laugh beside the fireplace while Daniel looked happier than I had seen him in years. At first, I truly wanted to love her too. There had been warning signs even then, though I ignored them. Madison asked unusual questions for someone visiting a boyfriend's parents for the first time. She wanted to know how long Arthur had owned his consulting business, whether our Vermont property had increased in value, whether Daniel would eventually take over family assets. Arthur answered politely while changing subjects whenever possible, but later that night, he admitted her curiosity unsettled him slightly. I defended her immediately. She is probably just trying to understand Daniel's future, I told him. Arthur looked unconvinced even then. I wish now that I had listened more carefully to the man who spent 40 years reading people for a living. Do you remember the engagement party? Rebecca asked quietly, interrupting my thoughts. I nodded slowly. Of course I remembered. Madison rented a rooftop restaurant in downtown Boston with sweeping city views and fresh orchids flown in from California. At the time, I thought Daniel must finally be doing exceptionally well financially. Now I understood much of that celebration had likely been funded through trust distributions Madison quietly manipulated behind the scenes. That was the first event billed partially through family accounts without your direct approval, Rebecca explained. Arthur noticed immediately. I turned toward her sharply. Why did he allow it? Rebecca sighed softly. Because Daniel begged him not to create conflict before the wedding plans became serious. My chest tightened painfully. Daniel knew. Maybe not everything. Maybe not every forged document or hidden transaction. But enough. Enough to ask his dying father for silence. That truth settled over me with crushing heaviness. I lowered myself slowly back onto the velvet sofa, because my legs suddenly felt weak. I kept blaming Madison because it was easier than accepting my son participated in this. Rebecca sat beside me carefully. Manipulation rarely succeeds without cooperation. The honesty in her voice hurt, but I appreciated it anyway. Too many people soften painful truths for women my age as though we cannot survive reality. But surviving reality is practically our generation's specialty. We survive funerals, betrayals, disappointments, loneliness, and children who slowly become strangers. We just learn to do it quietly. I looked down at the diamond bracelet on my wrist. Arthur gave it to me on my 60th birthday after surprising me with a weekend trip to Nantucket. I remembered walking along the harbor wrapped in his coat because the ocean wind felt colder than expected that evening. Arthur stopped near the water and said something I did not fully appreciate until years later. The people who truly love you, he told me, will never make you earn your place beside them. At the time it sounded romantic. Tonight it sounded devastating. A sudden burst of laughter echoed faintly from the ballroom, followed by the clinking of glasses. Rebecca checked the time quietly on her phone. The speeches are beginning soon. My stomach tightened again. Madison loved public attention. She probably planned to stand beneath those crystal chandeliers delivering emotional thank you speeches while guests admired her elegance. The thought almost would have amused me if it did not hurt so deeply. Do you think she ever cared about Daniel? I asked unexpectedly. Rebecca considered the question carefully before answering. I think Madison cares very much about the life she believes Daniel can provide. The distinction mattered more than I wanted to admit. I stared at the cream-colored envelope again before finally placing it slowly onto the coffee table. Arthur once told me marriage reveals character faster than almost anything else, I murmured. I thought he meant hardship. Rebecca's expression darkened slightly. Sometimes money reveals people faster. Another silence settled between us. Then Rebecca reached into the folder once more and removed a smaller sealed envelope bearing Arthur's handwriting. My breath caught immediately. What is that? A personal letter, Rebecca replied softly. Arthur instructed me to give it to you only if tonight became necessary. My fingers trembled as I accepted the envelope. Even after 4 years, seeing Arthur's handwriting still felt strangely intimate, like hearing his voice unexpectedly in a crowded room. I opened it carefully and unfolded the letter inside. Eleanor, if you are reading this, then I was right about what kind of people have surrounded our son. I am sorry for that more than I can explain. But I need you to remember something very important tonight. Loving Daniel does not require surrendering your dignity to keep him comfortable. You spent your entire life taking care of everyone else. Please do not spend the rest of it apologizing for existing. I had to stop reading for a moment because tears blurred the page completely. Rebecca remained silent beside me while I pressed trembling fingers against my mouth. Arthur knew. He knew exactly how this would unfold. More importantly, he knew me well enough to understand I would need permission before finally protecting myself. After several moments, I carefully folded the letter again and slipped it back inside the envelope. Then I wiped my eyes gently before standing. Eleanor, Rebecca asked quietly. I looked toward the ballroom doors where warm golden light spilled faintly into the hallway. The music had softened now. Guests were probably settling into their seats waiting for the bride and groom to begin their speeches. Madison probably believed she controlled the room entirely. She had no idea the foundation beneath her perfect evening had already started cracking. I picked up the black leather folder from the coffee table and handed it back to Rebecca calmly. Freeze the trust, I said softly. Rebecca studied my face carefully, perhaps searching for hesitation. She found none. Are you certain? She asked. I glanced once more at the envelope containing the wedding gift before placing it quietly back into my purse unopened. For years, I replied calmly. I kept confusing silence with kindness. Tonight, I finally learned they are not the same thing. Rebecca nodded once after I told her to freeze the trust. She did not look surprised. In many ways, I think she had been waiting years for me to finally stop protecting people who no longer protected me. She stepped toward the corner of the lounge and quietly pulled out her phone while I remained near the fireplace, trying to steady the storm of emotions rising inside my chest. Even after everything I had learned that evening, part of me still wanted Daniel to walk through those doors and explain there had been some terrible misunderstanding. Mothers never stop hoping for that moment, even when evidence is stacked directly in front of them. Rebecca spoke softly into the phone, using calm legal language I barely processed. Authorization codes, trust suspension procedures, asset distribution freezes. Each phrase sounded cold and clinical, but together they carried the weight of an earthquake preparing to split apart the life Madison thought she had secured permanently. When Rebecca finally ended the call, she slipped the phone back into her purse and looked toward me carefully. "It is done," she said quietly. I inhaled slowly. The words should have felt dramatic. Instead, they felt strangely peaceful, like locking the front door after years of leaving it open for people who kept stealing pieces of your life. "How long before anyone notices?" I asked. Rebecca checked the time again. "The hotel accounting department will receive notification first because the final vendor transfer was scheduled during the reception." I gave a faint, humorless smile. So somewhere downstairs, Madison's dream wedding is slowly becoming unpaid debt. Rebecca's expression remained composed, but I caught the faintest flicker of satisfaction in her eyes. "Yes," she replied calmly. "That is one way to describe it." A strange memory surfaced suddenly then. Daniel at 13 years old sitting beside Arthur at the kitchen table learning how to balance a checkbook. Arthur believed children should understand responsibility early. "Money is not power," he used to tell Daniel. "Character is what decides what people do with power." I wondered what Arthur would think if he could see our son now. Not cruel exactly. Worse than cruel, perhaps. Passive. Weak. The kind of weakness that allows selfish people to destroy families while pretending not to notice. Rebecca moved toward the door. "We should return before people start asking questions." I nodded slowly, though my stomach tightened immediately. Walking back into that ballroom felt different now. Earlier, I had returned to my seat feeling humiliated and small. Now I carried knowledge powerful enough to unravel the entire evening. But strangely, I did not feel triumphant. Only sad. Sad that it had come to this at all. As we stepped back into the hallway, the sound of music and conversation grew louder again. Waiters carrying trays of champagne hurried past us toward the ballroom entrance. Somewhere nearby, a photographer laughed while adjusting camera equipment. Everything looked elegant and polished on the surface. Nobody outside that lounge understood how quickly beautiful things can collapse when they are built on manipulation. Rebecca paused before we entered the ballroom fully. "Eleanor," she said gently. I looked toward her. "No matter what happens tonight, do not let anyone convince you this was caused by you." Her words settled heavily inside me because deep down I already knew what would happen once Madison discovered the truth. People like her never accept responsibility gracefully. They search for someone else to blame immediately. Usually the quietest person in the room. Usually the person most accustomed to apologizing. I straightened my shoulders carefully before stepping back inside the ballroom. The reception had progressed while we were gone. Guests sat at round tables glowing beneath candlelight, while servers poured wine beside silver dinner plates. The string quartet had been replaced by softer piano music now drifting through hidden speakers overhead. Near the dance floor, Daniel stood laughing with several friends from college, while Madison spoke animatedly beside her bridesmaids. For a brief second, I simply watched my son from across the room. His tuxedo fit perfectly. His smile looked relaxed and genuine. He seemed happy. That realization hurt almost more than the humiliation itself, because it meant Daniel had learned how to enjoy his life while ignoring my pain completely. Madison noticed me first. Her expression changed subtly the moment our eyes met. Surprise flickered across her face for half a second before the polished smile returned instantly. She glided toward me across the ballroom floor with effortless confidence, the stolen diamond brooch sparkling beneath. "Chandelier light." "Eleanor," she said sweetly. "There you are?" Daniel wondered where you disappeared to. I looked at her calmly. "I needed some air." Madison tilted her head sympathetically as though we were close friends instead of adversaries pretending to share a family. "Weddings can feel emotional after losing someone like Arthur," she said softly enough for nearby guests to overhear. "I know tonight must be difficult for you." There it was again, that carefully crafted cruelty disguised as compassion. Every sentence designed to remind people I was old, grieving, fragile, and unnecessary. Before tonight, I usually responded by shrinking smaller. But something inside me had changed permanently in that lounge upstairs. "Actually," I replied calmly, "Arthur prepared me for this evening quite well." For the first time all night, Madison looked uncertain. Only briefly. But I noticed. "That is good," she answered carefully. Daniel and I want family harmony moving forward. Family harmony. The phrase almost made me laugh aloud. I glanced toward the head table where expensive floral arrangements stretched nearly the full length of the stage. White orchids, imported roses, gold-trimmed candles. Every detail chosen to impress guests with elegance and wealth. Every detail financed through money Madison believed would always remain accessible. It certainly is a beautiful wedding, I said quietly. Madison smiled brightly again, reassured by my calmness. Thank you. It has been expensive, but worth every penny. Her emphasis on the final words was deliberate, another small humiliation hidden beneath polished conversation. Nearby guests smiled awkwardly without fully understanding the tension beneath our exchange. Madison stepped slightly closer. The speeches are starting in a few minutes, she said. I hope you do not mind, but my parents will speak before family tonight. We wanted to keep things organized. Translation: she did not want me speaking publicly at all. Not after seating me beside the kitchen. Not after labeling me family expense. She wanted me present only as decoration. A silent older woman funding a lifestyle while staying carefully out of sight. That makes sense, I replied evenly. Madison visibly relaxed again. She truly believed I would continue accepting humiliation quietly because I always had before. Then suddenly, across the ballroom near the entrance, I noticed two hotel managers speaking urgently with one another while checking documents on a tablet. One of them looked pale. My pulse quickened slightly. It had begun. Madison followed my gaze but appeared unconcerned. Probably another vendor issue, she said dismissively. Planning a luxury wedding is exhausting. Rebecca appeared beside me, then holding a glass of sparkling water. Her calm expression gave nothing away, but the brief glance she exchanged with me confirmed everything. The trust freeze had reached the hotel accounting department. Madison remained oblivious. For now. Daniel approached us a moment later, adjusting his cufflinks while smiling distractedly. Mom, he said quickly before kissing my cheek. You disappeared for a while. I searched his face carefully. Same blue eyes as Arthur. Same crooked smile. Same habit of avoiding difficult conversations whenever possible. I needed a little quiet, I replied softly. Daniel nodded absently before glancing toward Madison. The speeches are about to start. Afterward, we are doing the first dance. Madison slipped her arm through his possessively. And then dessert, she added brightly. Wait until everyone sees the cake. I looked toward the massive 7-tier wedding cake displayed near the dance floor beneath cascading white flowers. Another expense. Another symbol of luxury balanced entirely on money they no longer had access to. Daniel noticed my expression then and smiled faintly. Everything okay, Mom? For one dangerous moment, I almost told him the truth right there. Almost asked whether he understood how completely his wife had manipulated our family. Almost begged him to choose honesty before it became too late. But then I remembered table 19 beside the kitchen doors. I remembered the forged property documents. I remembered Madison wearing Arthur's stolen brooch while mocking me publicly. Most of all, I remembered years of silence every time Daniel watched his wife humiliate me and chose comfort over courage. So instead, I smiled gently at my son and answered with complete honesty for the first time in years. Actually, I said quietly, I think tonight is finally going to be very revealing for everyone. Daniel looked confused by my answer, but before he could ask what I meant, the wedding coordinator hurried toward Madison with the strained expression of someone trying desperately not to panic in front of guests. I noticed the moment Madison's smile tightened. Small changes become very obvious once you stop wanting to believe the best about people. Excuse me for 1 second, Madison said quickly before stepping away from us toward the side of the ballroom. Daniel frowned slightly and glanced after her. Probably another scheduling issue, he muttered. Rebecca sipped her sparkling water quietly beside me without saying a word. Across the room, I watched Madison walk toward the two hotel managers I had noticed earlier. One of them held a tablet while speaking rapidly. Even from a distance, I could see the color slowly draining from Madison's face. For the first time all evening, she no longer looked perfectly composed. She looked cornered. The sensation that followed inside me was not satisfaction exactly. It was relief. Relief that I was finally seeing consequences appear in real time instead of endlessly cleaning up emotional damage behind other people's selfishness. Daniel shifted beside me uneasily. I should probably check on her. You should, I replied calmly. He gave me a distracted nod before crossing the ballroom quickly toward Madison. As he approached, she immediately grabbed his arm and pulled him farther toward the hallway near the accounting office. Her movements were sharp now, urgent, no longer graceful. Rebecca lowered her glass slowly. She knows. I watched Daniel's posture stiffen while Madison spoke rapidly beside him. Even from across the ballroom, I recognized confusion turning into alarm on my son's face. How long before he realizes why? I asked quietly. Not long, Rebecca answered. Nearby guests remained mostly unaware that anything unusual was happening. The band softly transitioned into instrumental jazz while servers continued pouring wine and clearing dinner plates. Weddings are strange that way. Entire emotional disasters can unfold beneath crystal chandeliers, while people nearby continue complimenting floral arrangements. I returned slowly to table 19 near the kitchen doors. Earlier that seat felt humiliating. Now it felt strangely symbolic. Madison placed me there because she believed power belonged to whoever controlled appearances. She never understood that real power is quieter than that. Real power sits silently while arrogant people expose themselves publicly. As I sat down, one of the older guests from Daniel's college years approached hesitantly, holding a champagne flute. "Mrs. Whitaker?" he asked politely. I recognized him after a moment. Peter Lawson, Daniel's former roommate from graduate school. Arthur always liked him because he worked hard and treated people respectfully. "Peter," I said softly. "It has been years." He smiled warmly before glancing toward the hallway where Daniel and Madison still stood speaking intensely with hotel management. "Everything okay over there?" he asked carefully. I folded my hands calmly in my lap. "I think some unexpected financial matters are being discussed." Peter looked uncomfortable immediately. "I hope nothing serious happened." I studied his expression for a moment before answering honestly. Sometimes serious things happen long before people finally notice them. He seemed unsure how to respond to that. After a brief, awkward silence, he gently touched my shoulder. "You always treated Daniel's friends like family," he said quietly. "I never forgot that." Then he walked away before I could answer. His simple kindness affected me more than I expected. Over the years I had grown so accustomed to Madison's coldness that basic respect sometimes felt startling. I glanced around the ballroom, watching conversations continue beneath warm candlelight. Couples laughed beside the dance floor. Someone toasted loudly near the bar. The wedding cake still stood untouched beneath its display lights, elegant and towering and temporary. Everything looked beautiful. Fragile things often do. A few minutes later, Daniel returned alone. The moment I saw his face, I knew the situation had escalated quickly. His jaw looked tense. His tie slightly loosened. He stopped beside my table and lowered his voice. "Mom, can we talk privately for a second?" Rebecca remained seated quietly across from me, observing everything with calm legal patience. I looked up at my son. "Of course." Daniel glanced toward Rebecca uncertainly. "Alone." Rebecca stood immediately. "I will give you both space." She walked toward the bar area without another word, though I knew she remained close enough to intervene if necessary. Daniel sat heavily across from me, then ran a hand through his hair exactly the way Arthur used to whenever stressed. For one painful moment, he looked young again. Not like a groom at his wedding. Just a tired little boy trying to understand why life suddenly felt unstable. "The hotel says there is a problem with the payment transfers," he said quietly. I kept my expression neutral. "That sounds stressful." Daniel frowned. "Mom, this is serious. Apparently some trust authorizations were suspended tonight." There it was. The first crack. I folded my hands calmly. "I see." Daniel stared at me for several seconds. "You knew about this?" I held his gaze steadily. "I learned several things tonight." His eyes narrowed slightly then. Not angry yet. Suspicious. "Rebecca talked to you." It was not a question. "Yes," I answered simply. Daniel exhaled sharply and glanced toward the hallway where Madison still argued quietly with one of the hotel managers. "Mom, whatever she told you, I can explain." That sentence alone told me everything. Innocent people rarely begin with explanations before hearing accusations. "Can you?" I asked softly. Daniel leaned closer, lowering his voice further. "Things got complicated after Dad passed away. Madison handled a lot of the financial planning because I was overwhelmed." I listened silently. Some paperwork may not have been communicated properly. Communicated properly. Such careful language. No mention of forged documents. No mention of hidden withdrawals. No mention of my humiliation tonight. Just vague phrases floating safely around. The truth. Did you know Madison tried to access the Vermont Property Trust? I asked quietly. Daniel froze completely. The silence that followed lasted only a few seconds, but it felt endless. Mom, he started weakly. I already had my answer. He knew. Maybe not every detail. Maybe not every lie. But enough. Enough to remain silent while his wife slowly treated me like an obstacle instead of family. Daniel rubbed his forehead anxiously. It was supposed to be temporary. Madison thought reorganizing some assets before the wedding would make things easier tax-wise. Easier tax-wise. I almost laughed at the absurdity of it. Theft always sounds cleaner once privileged people describe it with financial terminology. And the forged signature? I asked calmly. Daniel's face drained of color immediately. What? Do not insult me further by pretending ignorance now. He looked genuinely shaken then. For the first time all evening, I think my son realized I was no longer willing to play the confused older woman desperate to keep peace at any cost. I did not know about forgery, he said quietly. I swear to you, Mom. I believed him. Oddly enough, that made everything worse. Because it meant Daniel had not become cruel exactly. Just weak enough to stand beside cruelty while benefiting from it. Your father warned me this might happen, I said softly. Daniel looked down immediately at the mention of Arthur. Shame flickered briefly across his face. Dad always distrusted Madison. No, I corrected gently. Your father distrusted greed. The ballroom lights dimmed slightly, then his staff prepared for speeches and dancing. Soft piano music drifted through the room while guests turned their attention toward the stage area. Across the ballroom, Madison finally started walking toward us again. Her expression looked composed once more, but I noticed the panic still hiding beneath it. Daniel followed my gaze and lowered his voice urgently. Mom, whatever this is, can we please handle it after tonight? There it was. The request I had heard my entire life. Keep quiet. Stay gracious. Protect everyone else from discomfort. I looked at my son carefully, trying to find traces of the boy who once cried after accidentally breaking one of my favorite teacups when he was 7 because he could not bear disappointing me. That boy had possessed honesty, accountability. Somewhere along the way, he learned silence was easier. Daniel, I said softly, do you know what hurt me most tonight? He swallowed hard, but said nothing. It was not the seating card. It was not the missing brooch. It was watching my own son stand beside someone who humiliates me and acting as though keeping peace matters more than keeping dignity. His eyes filled briefly with guilt then. Real guilt this time. Not panic over money. Before he could answer, Madison reached our table wearing a perfectly practiced smile that no longer fooled me at all. She slipped her hand possessively onto Daniel's shoulder before looking directly at me. Eleanor, she said sweetly, though tension sharpened every syllable now. Apparently, there has been some confusion involving the family trust. I met her gaze calmly beneath the ballroom lights while guests nearby continued laughing, completely unaware their elegant wedding reception was beginning to collapse one hidden transaction at a time. No, I replied quietly. There has been confusion involving your understanding of what belongs to you. For the first time since I met Madison Clark, her smile disappeared completely. Not softened, not tightened politely. Gone. The mask slipped just enough for me to finally see the panic underneath. Around us, guests continued chatting beneath warm chandelier light, completely unaware that the bride standing near the center of the ballroom was beginning to realize her carefully constructed future had started unraveling. Daniel looked trapped between us, his shoulders tense beneath his tuxedo jacket. He opened his mouth as though trying to calm the situation, but no words came out immediately. That silence alone told me more than excuses ever could. Madison recovered first, of course. Women like her survive by recovering quickly. She straightened slightly and forced a small laugh designed for nearby guests to overhear. I think there has been some misunderstanding about finances, she said smoothly. Wedding. Accounting can become very complicated. I looked at her calmly. Forgery is usually more complicated. The color drained from Daniel's face instantly. Madison's eyes sharpened. Just for a second, something cold flashed beneath her polished expression before she controlled it again. Excuse me, she asked quietly. The Vermont property documents. I replied evenly. The forged signatures. The trust withdrawals. Should we continue this conversation publicly or privately? Daniel inhaled sharply beside her. Madison stared at me for several long seconds, measuring how much I knew. That was the thing about manipulative people. They never panic because they feel guilty. They panic because they suddenly lose control of information. Eleanor, she said softly, lowering her voice, this is hardly the time. No, I answered calmly. The time was years ago when you first decided my kindness made me weak. Her jaw tightened slightly. Nearby, a waiter passed carrying champagne, while soft jazz drifted through hidden speakers overhead. Everything around us still looked elegant and beautiful. That contrast almost felt surreal. Families can collapse emotionally in the middle of luxury, while strangers continue complimenting the floral arrangements. Daniel finally stepped forward. Mom, please, he whispered. Not tonight. I turned toward him slowly. Do you know what is remarkable, Daniel? His eyes met mine reluctantly. Every time someone hurts me, your first instinct is not to ask whether I am okay. It is to ask me to stay quiet, so everyone else remains comfortable. Shame flickered across his face again. Real shame this time. Not fear about finances. Not embarrassment about appearances. Actual shame. But even then, he still did not defend me. That realization settled heavily inside my chest, because it confirmed something painful. My son had spent so long avoiding conflict that he no longer understood silence can become betrayal too. Madison touched his arm quickly. Daniel, we need to speak with the hotel manager immediately. Her voice sounded calm, but tension sharpened every word now. Daniel nodded distractedly before looking back at me desperately. Mom, can we talk? After the reception? Please. Before I could answer, Rebecca appeared beside our table again carrying her sparkling water with calm composure. Madison stiffened visibly the moment she saw her. Ms. Hayes, she said carefully, I did not realize you were still handling Whitaker legal matters. Rebecca smiled politely. I have handled them for nearly 3 decades. Madison forced another tight smile. Then perhaps you can help clarify this unfortunate accounting issue. Rebecca's expression never changed. There is no confusion regarding the trust suspension. Daniel looked stunned. Suspension? Madison immediately stepped closer to him. Daniel, not here. But Rebecca continued calmly, her voice quiet enough to remain private while still impossible to ignore. The Whitaker family trust contains protective clauses established by Arthur Whitaker prior to his death. Those clauses were triggered this evening. Madison's breathing changed slightly. Faster now. Less controlled. Triggered by what exactly? She asked carefully. Rebecca met her gaze evenly. Public humiliation and attempted financial exploitation of Eleanor Whitaker. The silence that followed felt enormous despite the music surrounding us. Daniel stared at Rebecca as though she had struck him physically. Madison looked furious now beneath the panic. That is absurd, she snapped quietly. Nobody exploited Eleanor. I almost smiled at that. Not because it was funny. Because manipulative people often reveal themselves most clearly once they realize politeness no longer protects them. You seated me beside the kitchen with a place card labeled family expense, I said calmly. You wore jewelry stolen from my bedroom. You attempted to access property using forged signatures. And you publicly mocked me for funding this wedding while believing you would eventually control the money yourself. Daniel looked physically ill now. Madison, tell me that is not true. She turned toward him instantly. Daniel, do not do this here. Tell me, he repeated more firmly. Her eyes flashed angrily. Your mother is twisting everything. Am I? I reached slowly into my purse and removed Arthur's letter. Your father spent the last year of his life preparing legal protection because he feared exactly this situation. Daniel stared at the envelope bearing Arthur's handwriting and seemed to stop breathing for a second. Dad knew, he whispered. My chest tightened painfully at the sound of his voice because beneath all the weakness and silence, I could still hear traces of the little boy Arthur adored more than anything in this world. Your father hoped he was wrong, I answered softly. Madison crossed her arms tightly now. This is unbelievable. We are standing in the middle of our wedding reception while your mother accuses me of crimes because of some old trust paperwork. Rebecca remained perfectly calm. Actually, the bank's fraud investigation began 3 months ago. Madison froze completely. There it was again. That tiny crack in her control. Investigation? Daniel repeated slowly. Rebecca nodded once. Several irregular transfer attempts connected to trust assets triggered internal review procedures. Daniel looked at Madison in genuine confusion now. You told me the Vermont paperwork was delayed because of tax filing issues. Madison's composure slipped further. Because that is what I was told. By who? Daniel asked. She hesitated too long. That hesitation changed everything. I watched realization spread slowly across my son's face like dawn breaking over something ugly he had spent years refusing to see clearly. Not all at once. Painful truths rarely arrive that cleanly. They arrive piece by piece until denial finally becomes impossible. Across the ballroom, the master of ceremonies tapped the microphone cheerfully. Ladies and gentlemen, we are ready to begin the speeches for our beautiful bride and groom tonight. Applause erupted around the room. Guests smiled and turned toward the stage completely unaware the bride standing near table 19 was fighting panic beneath her flawless makeup. Madison looked toward the microphone, then back at Daniel desperately. We need to handle this later. Daniel did not move immediately. He just kept staring at her. Did you forge my mother's signature? He asked quietly. Madison's eyes widened slightly. Daniel, lower. Your voice. Answer me. His voice was still soft, but something inside it had changed. Maybe not strength yet, but doubt. Finally, Madison exhaled sharply. I was trying to protect our future. There it was. Not denial. Justification. The most dangerous people rarely believe they are villains. They believe wanting something badly enough excuses how they obtain it. Daniel stepped back from her slowly like someone seeing a stranger where someone familiar used to stand. You told me Mom was becoming paranoid after Dad died. Madison looked furious now. Because she questioned everything I did. You gave her reasons to. The words shocked even him once they left his mouth. I could see it in his expression immediately. Years of silence cracked open by one unavoidable truth. Madison turned toward me then, her eyes cold and sharp beneath ballroom lights. Are you happy now? She asked quietly. The question settled strangely inside me because the honest answer was no. I was not happy watching my family fracture publicly. I was not happy knowing Arthur predicted all of this before he died. I was not happy realizing my son lacked the courage to face reality until consequences forced him to. No, I answered softly. I am simply finished pretending your behavior is normal. On stage, the master of ceremonies called for the bride and groom to come forward for their speeches, while guests applauded enthusiastically. Madison looked around the ballroom desperately now, trapped between maintaining appearances and losing control entirely. Rebecca glanced toward me calmly. What would you like to do next, Eleanor? I looked toward the stage glowing beneath crystal chandeliers, then at the towering wedding cake, then finally at the bride who spent years trying to erase me from my own family while living off the life my husband and I built together. And for the first time all evening, I realized something important. Madison had never actually believed I would fight back at all. Madison stood frozen for only a moment after I said I was finished pretending her behavior was normal. Then, just as quickly, the polished bride returned. I watched her straighten her shoulders, smooth, invisible wrinkles from her satin gown, and force another graceful smile onto her face as though the conversation we had just shared meant nothing at all. That was the thing about people like Madison. They believed appearances could survive anything if maintained aggressively enough. We are not doing this right now, she said quietly through clenched teeth before turning toward Daniel. The guests are waiting. Daniel still looked shaken. His eyes moved between Madison, Rebecca, and me like he no longer understood which version of reality he was supposed to believe. I almost pitied him. Almost. But pity becomes difficult after years of watching someone choose convenience over truth repeatedly. Madison slipped her hand around Daniel's arm and guided him toward the stage before he could say anything else. Guests applauded warmly as the newlyweds approached the microphone together beneath glowing chandelier light. The ballroom looked breathtaking from where I sat near the kitchen doors. Hundreds of candles flickered against mirrored walls. White orchids spilled across gold table runners. Crystal glasses shimmered beneath soft lighting, while the enormous wedding cake stood near the dance floor like a monument to luxury. Everything looked perfect. Expensive. Fragile. Rebecca returned quietly to the chair beside me. She is going to pretend nothing happened, she murmured softly. I watched Madison smile at the crowd while adjusting the stolen diamond brooch near her collarbone. Of course she is. The master of ceremonies raised his glass enthusiastically. Ladies and gentlemen, let us hear it one more time for the beautiful bride and groom tonight. Applause filled the ballroom again. Madison accepted it effortlessly, waving gracefully toward the crowd while Daniel managed a weak smile beside her. If someone had entered the room at that exact moment, they would have assumed they were witnessing a perfect wedding reception. That is what manipulation often looks like from the outside. Beautiful lighting hiding ugly foundations. Madison stepped toward the microphone first. "Thank you all so much for being here tonight," she began warmly. Her voice sounded smooth and emotional in exactly the right places. "This evening means everything to Daniel and me." Guests smiled. Several people dabbed tears from their eyes already. Madison always understood performance. "Family has always been incredibly important to us," she continued. I nearly laughed aloud at that. Rebecca took a slow sip of sparkling water beside me. Across the room, I noticed the hotel managers speaking urgently near the accounting office again. One of them kept glancing nervously toward the stage. They knew. Vendor systems had likely started rejecting payment authorizations already. Madison, however, continued speaking confidently into the microphone as though she still controlled the evening entirely. "Planning this wedding has been a journey filled with love, support, and sacrifice," she said dramatically. "And we are especially grateful to everyone who contributed to making tonight possible." Her eyes drifted deliberately toward me then. Several nearby guests turned their heads politely in my direction. Madison smiled sweetly. "Some people support families financially," she continued softly. "Others support them emotionally. We appreciate every contribution." There it was again. Another humiliation wrapped carefully inside elegant language. A public reminder that my role in the family existed primarily through money. A few uncomfortable glances passed between guests who clearly sensed something unpleasant beneath her words without fully understanding it. Daniel shifted slightly beside her, his expression tightening. "Good. Let him feel discomfort for once instead of outsourcing all of it onto me." Madison reached for Daniel's hand dramatically. "When Daniel and I first met," she said emotionally, "we dreamed of building a future together filled with stability, beauty, and opportunity." Stability, beauty, opportunity. Every word sounded different now, knowing how aggressively she pursued all three through manipulation. She smiled toward the crowd again. "And tonight is proof that dreams really do come true." At that exact moment, one of the hotel managers hurried toward the stage looking visibly distressed. He stopped near the master of ceremonies and whispered something urgently into his ear. The man's smile faltered instantly. Madison noticed the interruption immediately. So did Daniel. Tension rippled subtly through the ballroom, although most guests still remained unaware of what was happening. Madison continued speaking anyway, her voice slightly tighter now. "I also want to thank Daniel's mother for..." She paused abruptly as the wedding coordinator approached the edge of the stage looking pale. Madison lowered the microphone slightly. "What is it?" she hissed quietly, though the nearest table still heard her. The coordinator whispered rapidly into Madison's ear. I watched the bride's entire expression change in real time. Not dramatically. Worse than dramatic. Controlled panic. Her eyes widened slightly before darting toward the ballroom entrance where two more hotel staff members now stood waiting anxiously. Daniel leaned closer. "What happened?" Madison grabbed his wrist hard enough that even from across the room I noticed it. "Smile?" she whispered sharply through her teeth. "Do not react." Guests had definitely started noticing now. Conversations softened around the ballroom, while people exchanged uncertain glances. The music stopped entirely. Somewhere near the back, a champagne glass clinked awkwardly against a plate in the sudden silence. The wedding coordinator whispered something else into Madison's ear. This time I caught a few words clearly. "Transfer reversal, declined authorization. Accounting requires immediate resolution." Daniel's face lost all remaining color. Madison quickly turned back toward the microphone with a strained smile. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are just experiencing a tiny technical issue," she laughed nervously. "Please enjoy another round of champagne while we sort things out." Nobody moved immediately. People can sense when a room changes emotionally. They may not understand why yet, but they feel it. Madison stepped away from the microphone abruptly and pulled Daniel toward the side of the stage where the hotel managers waited. Their conversation became more heated almost instantly. Even from table 19, I could see Daniel running both hands through his hair while Madison spoke rapidly at the accounting staff. Rebecca leaned slightly closer to me. "The final ballroom payment did not clear," I kept my eyes on the stage. How much are we talking about? Approximately $140,000. I let out a quiet breath. The number did not shock me. Madison never did anything halfway. Nearby guests had begun whispering openly now. One woman at the adjacent table looked toward me carefully before lowering her voice to her husband. Across the ballroom, Madison suddenly pointed directly toward me while arguing with one of the managers. Daniel looked horrified immediately. He turned toward the ballroom and saw me watching calmly from my seat beside the kitchen doors. Our eyes met across the crowded room. In that moment, my son finally understood something important. I was not confused anymore. I was not intimidated anymore. And I was certainly not going to rescue him from consequences this time. Madison stormed down from the stage then, her satin dress swaying sharply behind her while guests stared openly now. Daniel followed several steps behind, looking exhausted and pale. She stopped directly beside my table, breathing faster than before though still trying desperately to appear composed. "Did you do this?" she demanded quietly. The room around us had become strangely silent. Even guests pretending not to watch were clearly listening now. I folded my hands calmly in my lap. "Do what?" Madison's eyes flashed angrily. "The trust suspension. The payment reversal. The hotel says authorization was withdrawn under Eleanor Whitaker's direct instruction." Hearing my full name spoken like an accusation should have intimidated me once. Instead, it sounded almost freeing. "That is correct," I replied evenly. Daniel closed his eyes briefly like a man realizing disaster had finally become unavoidable. Madison stared at me in disbelief. "You would sabotage your own son's wedding?" The irony of that question settled heavily between us. For years, she sabotaged holidays, family dinners, birthdays, and relationships while expecting endless patience in return. Now, the moment consequences appeared, she suddenly cared deeply about family. Harmony. "No," I said quietly. "I stopped financing people who humiliate me publicly while trying to steal from me privately." Several nearby guests looked visibly shocked now. The whispers grew louder around the ballroom. Madison glanced around, realizing too late that the conversation was no longer private. Her carefully curated image had started cracking in front of everyone. "This is insane," she snapped softly. "You are embarrassing Daniel." I looked directly at my son then. "No, Madison." Daniel embarrassed himself the moment he decided silence was easier than protecting his own mother. Daniel flinched like the words physically hurt him because deep down he knew they were true. Madison opened her mouth again, probably preparing another manipulation, another polished excuse, another carefully crafted lie disguised as concern. But before she could speak, the hotel manager approached our table holding a printed invoice with visible discomfort. "Mr. and Mrs. Whitaker," he said carefully. "Unless the outstanding balance is resolved immediately, we may need to discontinue certain reception services tonight." The silence that followed felt enormous. Then, slowly, I reached into my purse and removed the cream-colored envelope containing the $200,000 wedding gift I had planned to give Daniel earlier that evening. Madison's eyes locked onto it instantly. Hope flashed across her face so quickly it almost made me sad. She still believed money solved everything. She still believed I would sacrifice my dignity to keep their lives comfortable. I placed the envelope carefully on the table in front of me, but did not hand it over. Then I looked calmly at my son and his bride beneath the ballroom chandeliers, while every nearby guest watched in complete silence. "This," I said softly, "was going to be my gift to help you begin your future together. But after tonight, I finally realized something important. You were never asking for love from me, only access." The ballroom had become so quiet that I could hear the soft hum of the air conditioning above the chandeliers. Hundreds of guests sat frozen around white linen tables while Madison stared at the cream-colored envelope in front of me like it was the last stable piece of ground beneath her collapsing evening. Daniel looked equally stunned, though for different reasons. I think he finally understood the difference between receiving love and depending on it financially. "Access," Madison repeated sharply. "That is what you think this is about." I looked at her calmly. "No, I know exactly what this has been about for years." The hotel manager remained standing awkwardly beside our table, holding the unpaid invoice while pretending not to hear the conversation unfolding in front of half the reception. Nearby guests openly watched now. Nobody even attempted to hide it anymore. Elegant people become remarkably attentive once wealth and scandal collide publicly. Daniel rubbed his forehead again, exhausted and overwhelmed. Mom, please. Let us just sit down somewhere private and figure this out. Figure this out. Another soft phrase covering something ugly underneath. I studied my son carefully beneath the ballroom lights. His tuxedo still looked perfect. His hair remained neatly styled. From a distance, he probably still resembled a successful groom enjoying his wedding night. But up close, the cracks were obvious now. Fear, shame, confusion, regret. The problem was that regret arrived years too late. You had years to figure this out, Daniel, I said quietly. You only seem interested now that the money disappeared. My words landed harder than I intended. Pain flashed openly across his face before he lowered his eyes toward the floor. Madison immediately stepped closer to him protectively. That is unfair, she snapped softly. Daniel has done everything possible to support this family. Rebecca spoke for the first time in several minutes. Support generally does not involve forged property transfers. Madison turned toward her instantly. You keep saying that as though it has been proven. Rebecca remained perfectly calm. The bank's legal department seems fairly convinced. Daniel looked between both women with growing panic. Madison, he said slowly, did you sign something using Mom's name? She hesitated again. Tiny pauses had become her greatest enemy. Tonight, I was trying to simplify the trust restructuring process, she answered carefully. The paperwork was temporary. That is not an answer, Daniel whispered. I watched something painful happen inside my son right there beside table 19. Denial finally began losing its grip completely. It is one thing to suspect someone manipulates people quietly. It is another thing entirely to watch them justify it publicly while your entire life unravels around them. Madison lowered her voice further. Daniel, if we panic right now, everyone wins except us. Us. Not family. Not truth. Not dignity. Just us. That single word revealed everything Arthur understood years earlier. Madison viewed relationships like alliances protecting lifestyle and status. Nothing more. I slowly picked up the envelope from the table again, feeling its weight in my hands. $200,000. Enough for a home down payment. Enough to stabilize Daniel's struggling business. Enough to secure the future Madison desperately wanted. Earlier that afternoon, I had imagined giving it to my son with pride while Arthur's favorite song played during the reception. I had imagined tears, gratitude, family. Instead, I sat beside the kitchen doors watching my daughter-in-law unravel publicly because she lost access to money she believed belonged to her already. Eleanor, Madison said suddenly, forcing softness back into her voice, whatever misunderstandings happened before tonight, we can resolve them privately. There is no reason to embarrass Daniel in front of everyone. I almost smiled at the irony. She spoke about embarrassment now as though she had not intentionally humiliated me all evening. As though she had not seated me beside the service entrance with a card labeling me family expense. As though she had not mocked me publicly while wearing jewelry stolen from my bedroom. Manipulative people often believe accountability itself is cruelty once consequences finally arrive. You embarrassed Daniel, I replied quietly. I simply stopped protecting him from the results. Around us, whispers spread farther across the ballroom now. Guests pretended to sip champagne while openly listening. The string musicians had stopped playing entirely at some point during the confrontation. Even the waitstaff moved more quietly now. The atmosphere no longer felt like a wedding reception. It felt like the moment after a beautiful vase falls and everyone waits to see how many pieces remain intact. Daniel finally pulled out the empty chair beside me and sat down heavily. He looked exhausted suddenly. Older. Mom, he said softly without meeting my eyes. Did Dad really think I would let this happen? The question hurt more than I expected because beneath all the damage and silence, part of him still sounded like Arthur's son. I answered honestly. Your father hoped you would stop it. Daniel closed his eyes briefly. Across the ballroom, I noticed several of Madison's bridesmaids whispering anxiously together near the dance floor. Her parents stood near the bar looking pale and uncomfortable while hotel staff quietly discussed payment logistics nearby. The perfect evening Madison spent years constructing had started collapsing in under 20 minutes. And somehow, despite everything, I still felt grief more than triumph. Grief for Arthur. Grief for the family we used to be before manipulation and silence hollowed it out from the inside. Madison suddenly crouched beside Daniel's chair, lowering her voice urgently. Listen to me carefully. Your mother is emotional because of old misunderstandings, and Rebecca is making everything worse. We can fix this if you stay calm. Daniel slowly looked at her then. Did you take the brooch from Mom's bedroom? Madison blinked. What? The diamond brooch you wore tonight. Did you take it? She hesitated again. Tiny. Barely noticeable. But Daniel noticed this time too. You said it was forgotten in storage, he whispered. It was, she answered quickly. I found it while helping organize things after Arthur passed away. Without asking, Daniel pressed. Madison's composure cracked visibly. Oh my God, Daniel, it is jewelry. Why are we even discussing this right now? Because it was never about the brooch. It was about entitlement, permission, boundaries. Years of quietly taking pieces of someone else's life while insisting they were overreacting for noticing. Daniel stood abruptly then and stepped away from the table, pacing several feet toward the darkened dance floor. Guests watched openly now. Nobody even pretended otherwise anymore. Madison followed him immediately. Do not do this to me tonight, she hissed quietly. Daniel turned toward her slowly. To you? The exhaustion in his voice broke something inside me because for the first time, he sounded genuinely awake. Madison, my father spent his final year protecting my mother from us. Her expression hardened instantly. From her perspective, forgery is not perspective. Silence. Another terrible silence. I remained seated quietly while Rebecca observed everything beside me with calm restraint. She leaned slightly closer. He is finally seeing her clearly. I stared at my son standing beneath crystal chandeliers while his wedding guests watched his marriage fracture in real time. Yes, I whispered softly. Unfortunately, clarity often arrives after damage becomes irreversible. Madison crossed her arms tightly. You are seriously choosing your mother over your wife in the middle of our wedding? Daniel laughed quietly then, but there was no happiness in the sound. You spent years convincing me those were opposite sides. Madison looked stunned by the response. She opened her mouth again, probably searching for another explanation, another emotional manipulation, another way to redirect blame away from herself. But before she could speak, one of the hotel accountants approached cautiously holding another printed document. Mr. Whitaker, he said carefully, without immediate payment authorization, we will need to close bar service and postpone vendor settlement processing tonight. Madison looked horrified. You cannot shut down the reception. The accountant shifted awkwardly. Ma'am, the outstanding balance currently exceeds $100,000. Gasps spread softly across nearby tables. Madison turned instantly toward me again, panic finally overpowering pride completely. Eleanor, she said, voice trembling slightly for the first time all evening, please. We can discuss everything later. Just fix this now. There was at last. Not apology. Not remorse. Need. Pure desperate need. I looked at the woman who spent years treating me like an inconvenience and realized something strange. The moment she lost financial control, she also lost every ounce of superiority. Because beneath all the designer dresses, polished smiles, and calculated cruelty, Madison had built her confidence almost entirely on access to someone else's resources. Slowly, I placed the cream-colored envelope back into my purse unopened. Madison watched the movement with visible panic. Daniel watched silently beside her. Then I stood carefully from my chair near the kitchen doors, smoothing my blue dress calmly, while the entire ballroom waited to see what I would do next. No, I said softly. Tonight you finally get to experience what it feels like when the person you depend on stops pretending your behavior is acceptable.